Patasola, the curse of the one-legged woman. There is a question that the men of Antioquia, Colombia never dare to ask aloud. They think it sometimes late at night, when the jungle grows quiet and the moon hangs full and fat above the canopy. They think it when they hear sounds they cannot explain, when shadows move in ways shadows should not move. But they never ask it because asking would mean acknowledging that the answer might be real. The question is this: why on nights when the moon bleeds silver through the trees does a woman's cry echo from deep within the forest? The oldest woodcutters will tell you, if you ply them with enough aguardiente, that it is not a cry at all. It is a call, a summons. And if you hear it, if that voice sounds like your wife, your mother, your daughter begging for help somewhere in the darkness, you must do one thing and one thing only. You must run, because that is how she hunts. That is how she has always hunted. And she has been hunting for more than 100 years. What I am about to tell you is not legend. It is history written in blood and fire and the final screams of a woman whom even hell refused to take. This is the story of Patasola, the one-legged woman. And it begins as so many tragedies do with a marriage. The year was 1887. Colombia was still a wild country, then a place where civilization existed only in small pockets surrounded by endless walls of green. The jungles of Antioquia stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, swallowing mountains and valleys, whole, hiding secrets that the modern world would never find. Men went into those jungles to cut timber, to clear land, to carve out small pieces of existence from the indifferent wilderness. Many of them never came back. The jungle takes what it wants, the old women said. The jungle always collects its debts. Deep in one of these valleys, 3 days' hard ride from the nearest town, lay a coffee plantation called Hacienda del Silencio, the Hacienda of Silence. The name was not poetic fancy. Those who lived there said that at night the quiet grew so thick you could hear your own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through your veins. It was a silence that felt alive, that felt hungry, that seemed to press against the windows and doors of the small houses scattered across the estate like a predator testing for weakness. The owner of this land was a man named Don Hernando Vasquez. He was 53 years old that year, with a silver beard trimmed to meticulous perfection and eyes the color of amber that had gone cold. Don Hernando had buried 3 wives, inherited 2 fortunes, and answered to no authority but his own. In a place as isolated as Hacienda del Silencio, he was as close to a god as any mortal could be. The workers depended on him for everything, for shelter, for wages, for the right to exist on his land. He knew this, and he enjoyed it in the way that certain men enjoy power, quietly, completely, and without mercy. Among the families who worked the estate was that of Rafael Mendoza. Rafael was a woodcutter, one of the men who ventured into the jungle each day to fell the great trees that Don Hernando sold to merchants in Medellin. He was 32 years old, built like the timber he harvested, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging an axe and hands calloused until they felt like leather. A scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a falling tree that had nearly killed him 3 years prior. He was not handsome in the way of city gentlemen with their soft hands and perfumed collars. His was the beauty of the wilderness itself, rough, powerful, and dangerous when provoked. Raphael loved his wife with the kind of love that does not know how to speak its own name. He showed it through action rather than words, through the extra meat he always placed on her plate, through the way he worked, until his muscles screamed, so that she and the children would never go hungry. He had never learned pretty phrases or romantic gestures. He only knew that when he thought of Isabella, something in his chest grew warm, and when he imagined life without her, that same something grew cold as a grave. They had 2 children, Tomas, 8 years old, with his father's serious eyes, and Carmen, 5, who laughed like music and had never known a day of true hardship. In the evenings, Raphael would sit on the porch of their small house at the edge of the jungle, watching his children play in the dirt yard while smoke rose from the cooking fire inside where Isabella prepared their meal. In those moments, he believed he was the richest man in Colombia. He did not know that his paradise had a serpent. Isabella Mendoza had been Isabella Cordoba before her marriage. She was 26 years old, possessed of a beauty that seemed almost unfair in a place like Hacienda del Silencio. Her hair fell past her waist, black as a moonless night, catching the light in ways that made it seem almost liquid. Her skin held the warm brown of river clay, smooth despite the hard water and harsh soap that were all the estate could offer. But it was her eyes that men remembered. Dark brown, almost black, with something burning behind them. Some called it passion, some called it ambition. Later, people would call it something else entirely. Isabella had not always lived in poverty. She had grown up in Medellin, daughter of a merchant who dealt in textiles and false promises. She had learned to read, to write, to dream of a life filled with silk dresses and candle-lit ballrooms. Then her father's business collapsed under the weight of his gambling debts, and the family's fine house was sold, and Isabella found herself standing in the ruins of everything she had ever expected from life. She was 18 when she married Rafael. He had come to Medellin seeking work, and found her instead serving tables in her uncle's tavern with fury barely concealed behind her smile. He offered her the only thing he had himself, his strong back, his devoted heart, a small house on a plantation far from the city's cruelty. She accepted not out of love but out of desperation. Rafael was kind. Rafael was decent. Rafael was escape. For 8 years she tried to convince herself that escape was enough. It was not. The jungle pressed in on Isabella from all sides. Each morning she woke to the same view of endless green, the same sounds of birds and insects, and the distant crash of falling trees. Each day held the same tedious rhythm. Wake before dawn, cook breakfast clean, and the children cook lunch. Clean, and the children cook dinner clean, wait for a husband too exhausted to do more than eat and sleep. Each night she lay in the darkness beside Raphael, listening to his steady breathing, and felt something inside her slowly dying of thirst. She loved her children. That much was true and undeniable. But she had dreamed of so much more than motherhood. She had dreamed of music and laughter and conversations that sparkled with wit. She had dreamed of being seen, truly seen, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as Isabella, a woman with thoughts and desires and a hunger that domesticity could never satisfy. Raphael loved her. She knew this. He loved her with the devotion of a faithful dog, constant and uncomplicated and utterly incapable of understanding what she needed. He worked himself to exhaustion for her. He gave her everything he had. But everything he had was not enough, and the guilt of that knowledge made her resent him all the more. So when Don Hernando Vasquez turned his amber eyes in her direction, something inside Isabella did not recoil. Something inside Isabella leaned closer to the flame. No one could say exactly when it began. Perhaps it was that afternoon in the dry season when Isabella brought eggs to the main house as part of the estate's monthly tribute, and Don Hernando's gaze lingered on her a heartbeat too long. Perhaps it was that evening by the river when she had gone to wash clothes after dark to escape the heat and found the master of the estate walking alone, and he spoke to her not as a worker but as a woman. Perhaps it was 100 small moments, 100 tiny sparks building toward an inevitable conflagration. Don Hernando was old enough to be her father. His hands were soft, uncalloused, the hands of a man who had never worked a day in his life. But he had something Raphael lacked. He had words. He knew how to make Isabella feel like the center of the universe, like the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. He knew how to look at her and make her feel beautiful in a way she had not felt since she was a girl with dreams still intact. The truth that Isabella did not want to see was simple and cruel. Don Hernando was a collector of pretty things, and she was merely his latest acquisition. They met in an abandoned hut deep in the jungle, a place that had once served as a resting station for timber crews. Now it was just 4 rotting walls and a leaking roof, but to Isabella it became a palace. There, for a few stolen hours at a time, she was not a woodcutter's wife. She was not a mother changing dirty clothes and wiping runny noses. She was the woman she had always believed herself to be, desired and desiring, alive in ways that her real life never permitted. She told herself it was love. She told herself Don Hernando would take her away from this place, would restore her to the life she deserved. She told herself that the risks meant nothing because the reward would be worth everything. She was wrong on all counts. The affair continued for 4 months, 4 months of whispered lies and secret paths through the jungle, 4 months of passion that felt like redemption and tasted like poison. 4 months during which Isabella grew careless, and carelessness in a place as small as Hacienda del Silencio was a death sentence. In small communities, secrets are currency, and currency always finds its way into circulation. The rumor started with Rosario, an old woman who cleaned Don Hernando's house and had cleaned his father's house before that. She noticed things. The master leaving at odd hours, the master returning with the smell of a woman on his clothes, the master smiling in ways he had not smiled since his third wife died. Rosario told her daughter. Her daughter told her husband. Her husband told the other workers. Within weeks, the entire estate knew. They knew who they knew, where they knew how often. They discussed it in hushed voices in the fields and by the river and around cook fires after dark. They shook their heads and clicked their tongues and thanked God that it was not their wives, their families, their honor being dragged through the mud. And they waited with the patient cruelty of those who have nothing else to entertain them to see what would happen when Raphael found out. He found out on a Tuesday. Raphael was resting beneath the great ceiba tree at the edge of the clearing, eating the lunch Isabella had packed for him that morning. The day was hot, the work was hard, and his body ached in the familiar way that meant he was earning his keep. A man approached and sat beside him, a fellow woodcutter named Jorge, who had always smiled too much and asked too many questions. Jorge said nothing for a long moment. He just sat there watching Raphael eat, wearing an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and anticipation. Finally, he spoke. He said he was speaking as a friend, as a brother, as someone who cared about Raphael's well-being. He said that there were things happening that Raphael deserved to know about. He said that Isabella had been going into the jungle at night and that Don Hernando had been going to the same place, and that people were talking. Raphael stopped chewing. His face did not change, his body did not move, but Jorge, watching him closely, saw something shift behind his eyes. Something that had been alive went dark. Something that had been warm went cold. Raphael said nothing. He finished his lunch in silence, thanked Jorge for his concern, and went back to work. He swung his axe with the same steady rhythm he always used. He spoke to the other men with the same quiet courtesy. He gave no sign that anything was wrong. But that night after Isabella had gone to bed, Raphael took out his machete. He sat on the porch in the darkness, the blade across his knees, and he began to sharpen it. The sound was soft, almost musical steel singing against stone. He sharpened it until the edge could split a falling hair. He sharpened it until his reflection in the blade looked like a stranger. Then he put it away and went inside to lie beside his wife. He did not sleep. He lay there in the darkness, listening to Isabella breathe, and he thought about all the nights she had claimed to be gathering medicine in the jungle. He thought about all the times she had come home with flushed cheeks and tangled hair. He thought about how she looked at him now with something that might have been guilt, or might have been contempt, or might have been nothing at all. The man who lay there in that bed was not the same man who had woken up that morning. That man had been a simple woodcutter who believed in hard work and honest living and the sacred bond between husband and wife. That man was dead now, killed by a few whispered words beneath a ceiba tree. The man who remained was something else entirely. Isabella stirred beside him, murmuring something in her sleep. Perhaps a name, perhaps his name, perhaps not. Raphael stared at the ceiling and waited for the next full moon. He had been a patient man all his life, patient in his work, patient in his love, patient in his suffering. Now he would be patient in his vengeance. In the darkness of the Colombian night something had changed. The jungle sensed it. The animals sensed it. Even the silence of Hacienda del Silencio seemed to deepen, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the violence that was surely coming. And what was coming would birth a monster that would haunt these forests forever. The days that followed moved like shadows across water, shapeless and strange. On the surface, nothing had changed at the Mendoza household. Raphael still rose before dawn. He still kissed his children's foreheads before heading into the jungle. He still returned at dusk, with sawdust in his hair and exhaustion in his bones. He still sat at the table and ate the food his wife prepared, still lay beside her in the darkness, still breathed the same air she breathed. But something fundamental had shifted, something that lived beneath words and gestures in the spaces between heartbeats. Isabella felt it the way one feels a storm approaching long before the first clouds appear. The air had changed. The pressure had changed. Her husband looked at her now with eyes that seemed to see through her flesh and into some hidden chamber she had thought was hers alone. She told herself she was imagining things. Raphael had always been a quiet man. His silence was one of the things she had once found comforting about him, back when comfort was enough. He spoke through action rather than words, expressed love through labor rather than poetry. So when he grew quieter still, when his already sparse conversation dwindled to monosyllables and grunts, she convinced herself it was merely exhaustion. The timber season was demanding. The jungle was cruel to those who harvested its bones. Her husband was tired, nothing more. She did not see the way his hands lingered on his machete each evening, running his thumb along the edge he had sharpened to murderous perfection. She did not notice how he watched her when she thought he was sleeping, his eyes open in the darkness, tracking her every breath. She did not understand that the man lying beside her each night was no longer her husband, but something else entirely, something that wore Raphael's face like a mask while planning horrors behind it. Love makes us blind, but guilt makes us blinder still. Isabella could not see the danger gathering around her because seeing it would have required acknowledging what she had done to deserve it. The affair with Don Hernando continued, though something in it had soured. The passion that had once felt like liberation now carried an aftertaste of desperation. Isabella clung to their meetings with increasing fervor, sensing perhaps that she was grasping at smoke, that the fantasy she had constructed was beginning to dissolve. Don Hernando had grown distant. His touches, once electric, had become perfunctory. His words, once intoxicating, had turned hollow. He looked at her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read, something between boredom and calculation, and it made her feel like merchandise whose value was depreciating by the day. She confronted him about it one afternoon in their rotting sanctuary, the abandoned hut that smelled of mold and secrets. "Something is wrong," she said. "You have changed." Don Hernando laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Changed, I am exactly who I have always been. Perhaps you are only now seeing clearly. You said you cared for me. I do care for you, in my way. What does that mean?" He stood by the window, if the gap in the crumbling wall could be called a window, and looked out at the jungle pressing close on all sides. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man explaining something obvious to a slow child. "It means that I enjoy your company. I enjoy your body. I enjoy the way you look at me as though I hold the keys to heaven. But if you are waiting for me to rescue you from your little life, to carry you away to some fairy tale ending, you will wait forever. I am not that kind of man. I have never pretended to be." Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "But everything you said all those nights, all those promises." Don Hernando turned to face her, and his amber eyes held something close to pity. "My dear girl, I said what you needed to hear. That is the nature of these arrangements. Surely you understood that." She had not understood. Or perhaps she had understood and chosen to believe otherwise because the truth was too bleak to bear. Either way, the realization struck her like a physical blow. She had risked everything, her marriage, her children, her very life, for a man who saw her as nothing more than a temporary diversion. The tears came before she could stop them. Don Hernando watched her cry with the detached interest of a naturalist observing an insect. "There is no need for dramatics," he said. "We have had a pleasant time together. Let us not ruin it with unpleasantness now. Go home to your husband. Pretend none of this happened. In a few months you will barely remember my name." He moved toward the door, straightening his clothes, preparing to return to his world of privilege and power. "I hate you," Isabella whispered. He paused at the threshold and looked back at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, you do not. You hate yourself for believing in me. But you will recover. Women always do." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the darkness with the ruins of her illusions scattered at her feet. She did not know that every word of their conversation had reached another pair of ears. She did not know that Raphael was crouched in the undergrowth less than 20 paces from the hut, close enough to hear everything, close enough to see Don Hernando emerge and walk away without a backward glance. He had followed her. He had been following her for weeks, tracking her movements through the jungle with the silent expertise of a man who had spent his life in these woods. He knew the path she took. He knew the time she left. He knew exactly where she went and what she did there, but he had needed to see, to hear, to know beyond any possibility of doubt or denial. Now he knew. Raphael remained motionless. As Isabella eventually emerged from the hut, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. He watched her stumble back toward the path that led home, watched her pause to compose herself, to wipe her eyes and smooth her hair, to reconstruct the mask she would wear for him and the children. He felt nothing. That was the strangest part. He had expected rage, had braced himself for the volcanic eruption of fury that should accompany such betrayal. Instead, there was only emptiness, a vast cold void where his heart had once resided. The love he had carried for Isabella, that warm, constant presence that had sustained him through years of backbreaking labor and grinding poverty, had simply ceased to exist. In its place was something else, something patient and purposeful and utterly without mercy. He understood now what he had to do. The shape of it had been forming in his mind for weeks, but it had been vague, uncertain, more impulse than intention. Now it crystallized into perfect clarity. He would not confront Isabella. He would not rage and threaten and give her the opportunity to lie her way out of consequences. He would not alert Don Hernando to his knowledge and risk the powerful man striking first. No, he would wait, he would plan, and when the moment was right, he would act with the same precision he brought to his work in the forest. A good woodcutter knows that felling a tree is not about strength alone. It is about understanding where the weaknesses lie, about making the right cuts in the right order, about controlling exactly how and where the great trunk will fall. Raphael had been felling trees for 15 years. He knew how to bring down giants. Now he would apply those skills to a different kind of timber. The days crawled past like wounded animals. Raphael went through the motions of his life with mechanical precision, speaking when spoken to, eating when food was placed before him, sleeping when darkness fell. But behind his placid exterior, his mind was working constantly, refining his plan, anticipating obstacles, preparing for every contingency. He chose the night of the next full moon. It was practical, the extra light would help him navigate the jungle paths, but it was also poetic in a way he dimly appreciated. The full moon was when Isabella always went to meet her lover. The full moon would be when she met something else entirely. He began to watch Don Hernando's movements, learning the man's habits and schedules. He discovered that the master of the estate had grown predictable in his arrogance, taking the same route to the abandoned hut, arriving at roughly the same time each appointed night. Don Hernando did not bother with caution because it had never occurred to him that a mere woodcutter might pose any threat. He had lived his entire life untouchable, protected by wealth and status, and the assumption that lesser men would never dare to challenge him. That assumption would cost him everything. Raphael also began to prepare the scene. He visited the abandoned hut during the day when no one was there, studying its layout, noting the positions of doors and windows, calculating angles and distances. He identified where he would wait, where he would strike, how he would ensure that neither of his targets could escape. He was thorough. He was methodical. He was utterly calm. Isabella noticed nothing. She was too consumed by her own misery, by the collapse of the fantasy she had built around Don Hernando, to pay attention to the subtle changes in her husband. In a bitter irony, Raphael's emotional withdrawal, which should have alarmed her, actually made her life easier. A distant husband asked fewer questions. A husband lost in his own thoughts did not notice when her eyes grew red from crying or when she stared at nothing for long minutes at a time. She had not ended the affair. Despite everything Don Hernando had said, despite the brutal clarity of his rejection, she could not bring herself to stop. It was addiction now rather than affection, the desperate clinging of someone who knows they are drowning but cannot stop reaching for a lifeline that exists only in their imagination. She still went to the hut on full moon nights. Don Hernando still came, though. Now he treated her with barely concealed contempt, taking what he wanted and leaving as quickly as possible. Each encounter left her feeling more hollow than the last. She hated herself for her weakness. She hated Don Hernando for his cruelty. She hated Raphael for his obliviousness, for not seeing what was happening, for not fighting for her, for not giving her a reason to stop. She hated the jungle and the estate and her children's needy voices and the endless grinding sameness of every single day. But most of all, she hated the feeling that something terrible was coming, a feeling she could not shake no matter how hard she tried. It manifested in small ways at first. A chill down her spine when she caught Raphael looking at her. A sense of being watched when she walked the paths through the forest. Dreams from which she woke, gasping dreams of fire and blood, and a face twisted with rage that might have been her husband's face, or might have been something else entirely. One evening she found Raphael sitting on the porch, his machete across his knees, sharpening the blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel on stone seemed unnaturally loud in the twilight stillness. "You sharpen that every night now," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "Are you expecting to fight a war?" Raphael did not look up. "A man should keep his tools ready." "You never know when you might need them." "Need them for what? For cutting?" He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for just a moment she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Then it was gone, hidden behind his usual mask of weary stoicism. What else would a machete be for? Isabella went inside without another word. Her hands were trembling, though she could not have said exactly why. It was just a machete, just her husband maintaining his equipment as any worker would. There was nothing sinister in it, but she could not shake the image of his eyes in that brief, unguarded moment. They had looked at her the way one might look at a tree marked for felling. The full moon approached like an executioner's footsteps. Isabella grew increasingly nervous as the date drew near. Some part of her, the part that still retained a connection to instinct and survival, was screaming at her to stay home this time, to end things with Don Hernando once and for all. To pour her energy into her marriage, her children, the life she had chosen, even if she had not wanted it. But another part, the part that had been starving for 8 years in this green prison, could not accept that this was all there would ever be. One more night, she told herself, one more meeting. Perhaps Don Hernando would be different this time. Perhaps he would realize what he was losing. Perhaps. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most convincing. On the afternoon before the full moon, Raphael came home early from work. This was unusual enough to draw comment from Isabella, who was preparing dinner while the children played outside. "You are back soon," she said. "I finished my section ahead of schedule." Raphael sat at the table watching her move around the small kitchen. "The foreman let me go." "Are you feeling well? You look pale." "I am fine." He paused, then added with strange emphasis, "I am better than I have been in a long time." Isabella felt that chill again, that sense of wrongness she could neither explain nor ignore. She turned to look at her husband. Really look at him for the first time in months. He sat perfectly still, his calloused hands resting flat on the rough wooden table. His face was calm, almost peaceful, but there was something behind his eyes that she had never seen before. It reminded her of the jungle itself, of the way the forest could seem serene and beautiful while concealing jaguars and vipers and 1,000 other ways to die. "Raphael," she said slowly, "is something wrong?" "Why would anything be wrong? I do not know. You seem different lately." Different how? She struggled to articulate what she sensed. It was like trying to describe a color she had no name for, a sound pitch just below the range of hearing. Just different, distant, like you are here but not here. Raphael considered this for a moment. Then he smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps I have simply been thinking," he said. "A man does a lot of thinking when he works alone in the forest all day. He thinks about his life, his choices, the people he loves." He stood and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at her. "He thinks about what he would do if he ever lost those people, how far he would go to make things right." He walked outside before she could respond, leaving Isabella standing alone in the kitchen with her heart pounding against her ribs. She should have understood then. She should have seen the warning blazing like a signal fire in the darkness. But people rarely see what they are not ready to see, and Isabella was not ready to see the death that had come to live in her husband's heart. That night she put the children to bed and lay down beside Raphael in the darkness. He was already there, stretched out on his back, staring at the ceiling with unblinking eyes. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, "I need to go out, to gather medicine." "Some plants can only be harvested under the full moon." Raphael did not move. His voice, when it came, was perfectly flat. "Of course, you must do what you need to do. You do not mind." "Why would I mind?" She waited for him to say more, to ask questions, to express any of the suspicion that a husband should feel when his wife announced plans to venture into the jungle alone at night. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Finally, Raphael spoke again. "Be careful out there. The jungle is dangerous after dark. You never know what might be waiting in the shadows." Isabella lay awake long after his breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep, or what she thought was sleep. She did not see the way his eyes remained open in the darkness, watching the ceiling, watching the hours pass, waiting for the moon to rise and the trap to close. The day of the full moon dawned clear and hot, the sky a merciless blue unmarked by clouds. Isabella moved through her tasks with distracted efficiency, her mind already in the abandoned hut, already rehearsing what she would say to Don Hernando. She would end it tonight. She had to. Whatever scraps of self-respect she still possessed demanded it. She would tell him that she was done being used, done being discarded, done being made to feel worthless. She would tell him to find another toy to play with, and then she would go home and try to rebuild her life from the ashes of her mistakes. It was a good plan, a sensible plan. If she had followed it, everything might have been different. But she did not follow it, because when she arrived at the hut that night and found Don Hernando waiting, all her resolve crumbled. He was different somehow, softer, more attentive than he had been in weeks. He touched her face and called her beautiful. He whispered promises that she knew were lies but wanted desperately to believe. And so she stayed. Stayed longer than she should have, letting herself be seduced one final time by the fantasy she had built around this man and this place. She did not hear the footsteps approaching through the jungle. She did not see the shadow that fell across the doorway. She did not know that death had arrived until Don Hernando's eyes went wide with sudden terror, fixed on something behind her. Isabella turned. Raphael stood in the entrance of the hut, silhouetted against the moonlight, his machete gleaming in his hand. He did not look like her husband anymore. He looked like something carved from the darkness itself, a figure of vengeance given human form. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The night creatures had fallen silent, as if every living thing within earshot had sensed the violence about to unfold. Then Raphael stepped inside, and the moonlight fell across his face, and Isabella saw what lived in his eyes now, and she understood that the man she had married was gone forever. What remained was judgment, and judgment had come to collect. The three of them formed a triangle of fate in that rotting space, each point connected to the others by invisible lines of love and hatred and betrayal. Raphael at the door, his machete catching fragments of moonlight. Don Hernando by the far wall, his face drained of color, his aristocratic composure crumbling like wet paper. Isabella between them, frozen in the particular paralysis of someone who has always known this moment would come but refused to believe it until now. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. 4, 5. Then Raphael spoke, and his voice was worse than any scream could have been. It was calm, conversational. The voice of a man discussing the weather or the price of coffee. "Good evening," he said. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Don Hernando recovered first, drawing himself up with the instinctive arrogance of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. "Raphael, what is the meaning of this? How dare you come here, and how dare I?" Raphael stepped further into the hut, and both of his targets retreated instinctively. "How dare I come to the place where my wife spreads her legs for another man? Is that what you are asking me, patron?" The word dripped with contempt. Don Hernando's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, not by anyone, certainly not by a mere woodcutter, whose existence he had barely acknowledged. Isabella found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Raphael, please, let me explain." Explain what Raphael's eyes moved to her, and she flinched as though he had struck her. "Explain how you have been coming here for 4 months. Explain the lies you told me every time you walked out the door. Explain how you let this man touch you while I worked myself half to death to provide for our family. I was weak," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was foolish, but I never stopped loving you. I swear to you, Raphael, I never—" "Do not." His voice cracked like a whip, and she fell silent. "Do not speak to me of love. You do not know what that word means. You never did." He turned back to Don Hernando, who had been edging slowly toward the window. The movement stopped when Raphael's gaze fell upon him. "And you, the great Don Hernando Vasquez, master of Hacienda del Silencio, owner of everything and everyone for miles around." Raphael's lip curled. "Did it amuse you, taking another man's wife, making me a fool in front of everyone who works for you?" Don Hernando made a visible effort to regain control of the situation. His voice, when he spoke, had recovered some of its usual smoothness. "Raphael, I understand you are upset. You have every right to be. But let us discuss this like reasonable men. There is no need for violence. I can compensate you. Whatever you feel you have lost, I can replace it tenfold. Compensate me." Raphael tasted the word as though it were something foul. "You think this is about money? Everything is about money." Don Hernando's confidence was returning now, built on a lifetime of seeing people bend to his will. "Name your price. Land, I will give you the best plot on the estate. Gold, I have plenty. A new house, consider it done. Whatever you want, it is yours. We can forget this ever happened." Raphael was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider the offer. Hope flickered briefly in Don Hernando's amber eyes. Then Raphael laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It held no humor, no warmth, nothing recognizably human. It was the laugh of something that had crawled up from deep underground, something that had never seen sunlight or felt joy. "You still do not understand," Raphael said when the laughter died. This is not a negotiation. There is nothing you can offer me that I want. The only thing I wanted, the only thing I ever wanted, was a wife who loved me and children who would grow up proud of their father. He gestured at Isabella with the machete. She took that from me, and you helped her do it. Raphael, please, Isabella started. Be quiet. I will deal with you soon enough. He advanced on Don Hernando, who backed away until his shoulders hit the wall. The older man's composure finally shattered completely. His face contorted with fear, and when he spoke, his voice had risen to something close to a whine. You cannot do this. Do you know who I am? Do you know what will happen to you if you harm me? They will hunt you down. They will hang you in the plaza. Your children will watch their father die like a criminal. My children will never know what happened here tonight. Raphael stopped an arm's length from Don Hernando, close enough to smell the sweat of terror on the man's skin. As far as anyone will know, you disappeared into the jungle. It happens. Men vanish in these forests all the time. I will give you anything you want. Just name it. Don Hernando was babbling now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. I will leave the estate. I will go back to Bogota. You will never see me again. I will... Raphael grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall with enough force to crack the rotting wood. Don Hernando gasped, the air driven from his lungs. You had everything, Raphael said, his face inches from the other man's. Wealth, power, any woman you wanted, but that was not enough for you. You had to take mine. He tightened his grip, and Don Hernando made a choking sound. Do you want to know what I have been thinking about for the past 3 weeks, every night while I lay next to her, while I listened to her breathe? I thought about this moment. I thought about what I would do when I finally had you in front of me. And do you know what I decided? Don Hernando shook his head frantically, unable to speak. I decided that a man who takes another man's wife deserves to lose his head over her. Raphael released his grip and stepped back. Don Hernando slumped against the wall, gasping for air, one hand clutching his bruised throat. Please, he wheezed. I am begging you, have mercy, mercy. Raphael raised the machete, examining the blade as though seeing it for the first time. I have been a merciful man all my life. I forgave debts that others would have collected with blood. I let insults pass that others would have answered with violence. I believed that mercy was a virtue, that God rewarded those who showed compassion to their enemies. He looked at Don Hernando, and his eyes were empty of everything but purpose. I do not believe that anymore. The machete came down. Isabella screamed. The sound tore from her throat without conscious thought, a primal shriek of horror that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She had seen animals slaughtered. She had seen men injured in logging accidents, bones protruding through flesh, blood soaking into sawdust. But she had never seen anything like this. The blade caught Don Hernando at the junction of neck and shoulder and continued through with barely a pause. Raphael's arms were strong from 15 years of swinging an axe, and he had sharpened the machete until it could slice through seasoned hardwood. Human flesh and bone offered little resistance. Don Hernando's head did not come off cleanly. It took 2 strokes, the first cutting most of the way through the second, completing the separation with a wet crunch that Isabella would hear in her nightmares for whatever remained of her life. Blood sprayed across the wall of the hut, across Raphael's face and chest, across the floor, where it began to pool with terrible swiftness. The body remained standing for an impossible moment, blood fountaining from the severed neck arms, twitching in the random spasms of a nervous system that had not yet received the message of its own death. Then it collapsed, crumpling in on itself like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The head rolled a few feet before coming to rest against a pile of rotting timber. The eyes were still open, still wide with the terror of those final moments. The mouth hung slack, caught forever in the middle of a plea that would never be finished. Raphael stood over the corpse, breathing hard, painted in the blood of the man who had cuckolded him. He did not look triumphant. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task and was already thinking about the next one. He turned to face Isabella. She scrambled backward, her hands and feet slipping in the blood that was spreading across the floor. No, 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 no. The word came out in a continuous stream, a prayer or a curse or simply the only sound her mind could produce. Raphael, please, I am your wife. I am the mother of your children. Please, 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 you were my wife. Raphael advanced on her, and she saw that the emptiness in his eyes had not changed. Don Hernando's death had not satisfied it. Nothing would satisfy it. You stopped being my wife the first time you lay with him? The mother of my children? Yes, you are that, and it is the only reason you are still breathing. He reached down and grabbed her ankle before she could react. His grip was iron, the hand of a man who crushed wood for a living. Isabella kicked and thrashed, but she might as well have been fighting against a tree. Do you know what I keep thinking about? Raphael asked, dragging her toward the center of the hut. I keep thinking about all those nights you told me you were going to gather medicine. I keep thinking about how you walked out the door and down the path and into the jungle, and the whole time you were walking toward him, he yanked her legs straight and she felt the bones grind together under his grip. These legs carried you to him night after night. These legs walked away from me and toward him. Isabella understood then in a flash of clarity that cut through her terror like lightning through storm clouds. She understood what he intended to do. No, her voice was barely a whisper. Raphael, no, you cannot. You cannot. I can. His voice was perfectly calm. He positioned her leg against a raised section of the floor, a crossbeam that had once supported a wall partition. And I will consider it a lesson. Every time you look down at yourself, you will remember what you did. Every time you try to walk, you will remember where you walked to. Every time you feel the pain, you will remember the pain you caused me. Think of the children. Isabella was sobbing now, her words barely coherent. Think of Tomas and Carmen. They need their mother. They need me whole. They needed a mother who loved their father. They needed a mother who kept her vows. They needed a mother who did not spread herself for the first rich man who whispered pretty lies in her ear. Raphael raised the machete. They did not get that mother. They got you instead. I will change. I swear to God I will change. I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Just give me a chance. One chance. Please. Raphael paused, the machete held high, his face unreadable in the shadows. For a moment Isabella dared to hope. Perhaps something in her words had reached him. Perhaps some remnant of the love they had once shared still lived in his heart. Perhaps mercy was not entirely dead. Then Raphael spoke, and his words killed her hope more surely than any blade could have killed her body. When I was young, my father told me something I never forgot. He said that the tree does not bargain with the axe. It simply falls. He looked down at her with eyes that held nothing but cold purpose. You are the tree, Isabella, and I am the axe. There is nothing more to say. The machete descended. The sound that came from Isabella's throat was not a scream. It was beyond screaming, beyond any vocalization she had ever produced or heard. It was the sound of a soul being torn in half, of a mind shattering under an impact too great to absorb. The blade bit into her leg just below the knee, powered by all the strength in Raphael's powerful arms. But a human leg is not a tree branch. There is muscle and sinew and bone, and even the sharpest blade does not pass through them easily. The machete cut deep, deep enough to sever the major blood vessels, deep enough to expose the white gleam of bone, but it did not complete the amputation. Raphael raised the blade again. The second stroke was worse than the first, not because it cut deeper, but because Isabella was fully conscious now, fully aware of what was happening to her. She felt the steel grinding against bone. She felt the spreading wrongness as her leg was carved away from her body. She felt the blood, hot and wet, pumping out onto the wooden floor with each beat of her racing heart. Still, the leg did not come free. Raphael adjusted his angle, his face set in concentration, approaching the task with the same methodical precision he brought to his work in the forest. A difficult cut required patience. required multiple attempts, required the willingness to continue until the job was done. The third stroke severed the leg completely. Isabella's scream cut off abruptly as her body, overwhelmed by trauma, began to shut down. She stared at the ceiling of the hut, her vision graying at the edges, distantly aware that she was lying in a spreading pool of her own blood. She could feel her leg, could feel toes that were no longer attached to her phantom sensations, firing in a limb that now lay separate from her body. Raphael stood over her, looking down at his work. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from something else, some emotion he could not or would not name. Blood dripped from the machete from his hands, from his face, where it had sprayed during the cutting. "Now you will remember," he said. "For whatever time you have left, you will remember what you did and what it cost you." Isabella tried to speak, but no words would come. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish pulled from water. She was dying. She could feel it, the cold creeping in from her extremities, the darkness pressing at the edges of her consciousness. She had minutes left, perhaps less. Raphael walked to the corner of the hut where an oil lamp sat on a small shelf. He had noticed it during his preparations, had incorporated it into his plan. He picked it up, felt the weight of the fuel inside, and carried it to the pile of dry straw and rotting wood in the opposite corner. The children, Isabella managed to whisper, "Please, take care of them." Raphael paused. For the first time since entering the hut, something flickered in his eyes, some shadow of the man he had once been. "I will take them far from here. I will raise them to be better than either of us. They will never know what their mother became." He threw the lamp. The oil splashed across the dry kindling and ignited instantly. Flames leaped up, hungry and eager, spreading with terrifying speed across the tinder-dry floor of the abandoned structure. Within seconds, the fire had reached the walls. Within a minute, it was climbing toward the roof. Raphael walked to the door without looking back. He paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the moonlight, and spoke his final words to the woman he had once loved. "The jungle will do what it will do. Perhaps you will burn. Perhaps you will bleed to death first. Perhaps the animals will find you." He stepped outside into the night air that smelled of smoke and blood and endings. Either way, Isabella Mendoza dies tonight. Whatever comes after, whatever crawls out of these ashes, it will not be you. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving Isabella alone with the fire and the corpse and the ruins of everything she had ever been. The flames spread with hungry enthusiasm, consuming the dry wood of the hut as though it had been waiting decades for this meal. Heat washed over Isabella in waves, each one more intense than the last. Smoke filled her lungs, making her cough, making her eyes water, adding a new dimension of suffering to the agony already consuming her. She was going to die here. The certainty of it settled over her like a shroud. She had lost too much blood. She was too weak to move. The fire was too fast. In minutes, perhaps seconds, the flames would reach her, and then it would be over. A fitting end, perhaps, for a woman who had burned down her own life chasing warmth she did not deserve. But somewhere deep inside her, in a place beyond pain and fear and despair, something refused to accept this fate. It was not courage. It was not hope. It was something older and darker, a survival instinct that predated thought, that came from the same ancient place as hunger and rage and the will to destroy. Isabella began to move. She did not know how. Her body was broken, her blood was draining away, her mind was fragmenting under the weight of trauma. But somehow she crawled, dragging herself with her arms, pushing with her remaining leg, leaving a trail of blood and burned skin behind her. The fire was everywhere now, the heat unbearable, the smoke so thick she could barely see the door. But she reached it. She pulled herself over the threshold and collapsed on the damp earth outside, gasping for air that did not sear her lungs. Behind her, the hut was fully engulfed, flames shooting up through the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like malevolent stars. Inside, Don Hernando's body was burning, his flesh charring, his bones blackening in the inferno. Isabella lay in the dirt and stared up at the moon. It hung above her, full and fat and silver, completely indifferent to the horror it had witnessed. She thought about her children asleep in their beds, not knowing that their mother lay dying in the jungle. She thought about Raphael walking home through the darkness, his hands still wet with her blood. She thought about Don Hernando, who had promised her escape and delivered only destruction. And she thought about God. She had believed in God once in the way that most people believe, casually, unquestioningly, without ever testing the limits of that faith. Now she lay bleeding in the dirt, one leg severed, her flesh burned, her life measured in the diminishing beats of her heart, and she wondered where God was in all of this. Was he watching? Did he care? Had he already turned his face away from her, disgusted by her sins? Or was there something else watching? The thought came from nowhere, or perhaps from everywhere at once. Isabella became aware slowly that the jungle around her had changed. The normal sounds of night, the insects and frogs and distant bird calls, had fallen silent. The air itself felt different, heavier, charged with something she could not name. And there were shadows moving in the trees, not the natural movement of branches in the wind. This was something else. Shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk, that occupied spaces between the leaves where nothing should have been able to fit. She felt them more than saw them, presences at the edge of her failing vision, watching her with an attention that was nothing like human curiosity. Isabella tried to pray. The words would not come. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged, and even if she could have spoken, she no longer knew what to say. Our Father who art in heaven, but heaven seemed very far away. She was not sure it had ever been close. The shadows drew nearer. They did not speak in the way that humans speak. There were no words, no sounds at all. But somehow Isabella heard them anyway, felt their communication directly in her mind, bypassing ears that were already failing. Pain, they whispered, and the whisper was like wind through dead leaves. So much pain, so much anger, so much beautiful darkness. Isabella wanted to recoil, to scream, to drag herself away. But she could not move. She could only lie there as the shadows gathered around her, as their presence pressed against her consciousness like cold fingers probing an open wound. "You are dying," they said. "Your flesh is failing. Your blood is draining away. Soon there will be nothing left but bones and memories." She tried to respond, but her voice was gone. "But we can help you." The shadows seemed to pulse with something that might have been eagerness. "We can give you life. We can give you strength. We can give you the power to make those who wronged you pay for what they did." Isabella's mind, even in its shattered state, recognized the nature of this offer. She had heard stories, whispered tales of people who made bargains with things that lived in the dark places of the world. The stories never ended well. The price was always too high. But what did she have left to lose? Everything had been taken from her. Her husband had mutilated her and left her to die. Her lover had used her and discarded her like garbage. Her children would grow up believing she had abandoned them. Her life, such as it was, would end in this jungle unmourned and unremembered, unless she accepted what was being offered. "What do you want in return?" She did not speak the words aloud. She did not need to. The shadows heard her thoughts as clearly as if she had shouted them. "Your soul," they answered. "Your humanity. Everything you were, everything you might have been. You will belong to the darkness, and the darkness will belong to you. You will hunt and kill and feed until the end of time itself." "And Raphael, what about him?" The shadows seemed to laugh, though the sound was nothing like human laughter. "Vengeance is yours to take. We do not care who you destroy or why. We care only that you destroy." Isabella thought of her children, of their sleeping faces, of the way Carmen laughed, and the way Thomas tried so hard to be brave. She thought of the life she could have had if she had been stronger, wiser, better. She thought of all the mistakes that had led her to this moment, bleeding out in the dirt while something ancient and terrible offered her a second chance at existence. It was not a good bargain. Some part of her, the part that still remembered prayers and church bells and the smell of incense, knew that accepting this offer meant damning herself forever. It meant becoming something that should not exist, something that fed on darkness and pain and the destruction of others. But that part of her was very small now and growing smaller by the second. The rest of her, the part that had been carved away and burned and abandoned to die, that part wanted only one thing: revenge. Yes, she thought. Yes, I accept. Give me the power to make him pay. The shadows descended. They did not enter her body through any physical orifice. They simply passed through her skin, through her flesh, through the very essence of what she was. It felt like drowning in ice water. It felt like being burned alive from the inside. It felt like nothing she had ever experienced or could ever describe. And then the pain began. Not the pain of her wounds, which had faded to a distant throbbing as her body surrendered to shock. This was different. This was the pain of transformation, of being unmade and remade according to a design that human minds were never meant to comprehend. Her bones shifted beneath her skin. Her muscles rewove themselves into new configurations. Her organs changed, adapted, became something other than what they had been. She screamed, and the sound that emerged from her throat was not human. It was the shriek of a hunting cat, the howl of a wolf, the cry of something that had never existed in nature but lived now in the space between darkness and darker still. The stump of her leg sealed over, not with scar tissue, but with smooth, pale skin that gleamed in the moonlight. Her remaining leg changed, grew stronger, the muscles dense and powerful beneath flesh that had turned the color of old bone. Her hands elongated, the nails extending into curved talons, sharp enough to cut through hardwood. And her face. Her face became something terrible. The beauty was still there, preserved like a flower pressed in a book, but it was beauty turned wrong, beauty weaponized. Her eyes sank deeper into their sockets, becoming pools of darkness that reflected light in ways that eyes should not. Her mouth widened, and within it her teeth lengthened into fangs designed for tearing flesh. Her hair grew wild and thick, falling around her face like a shroud. When the transformation was complete, the thing that had been Isabella Mendoza rose to its feet, 1 foot. It balanced on its single leg with perfect ease, as though standing on one limb was the most natural thing in the world. And in a way for this creature it was. The darkness that now lived inside it had reshaped everything, had turned weakness into strength, had made the mark of her mutilation into something else entirely. The creature looked down at itself, at its pale skin and curved claws and the place where a leg had once been. It felt the power coursing through its new form, power that made Raphael's strength seem like a child's compared to a giant. It felt the hunger, too, a void at the center of its being that demanded to be filled. And it felt the hatred. The hatred was the one thing that had survived the transformation unchanged. If anything, it had grown stronger, purified by the fire of rebirth into something absolute and eternal. The creature that had been Isabella hated with a purity that living beings could not achieve. It hated Raphael. It hated Don Hernando, even though he was beyond reach now. It hated everyone who had ever looked down on her, used her, betrayed her, and it would make them all pay. The creature opened its mouth and produced a sound unlike anything that had ever been heard in those jungles. It was a cry and a howl and a laugh all at once, a declaration of existence that echoed through the trees and sent every living thing within earshot fleeing for its life. La Patasola had been born. The creature spent its first hours exploring its new form. It discovered that it could move through the jungle with incredible speed, faster than any human could run. Its single leg was not a handicap, but an advantage, allowing it to leap and bound through the undergrowth with the agility of a hunting spider. The darkness that had created it also sustained it, feeding it energy that seemed to have no limit. It discovered that it could change its appearance. Not completely, not into anything truly different, but enough. It could smooth out the more monstrous aspects of its face, could make itself appear almost human to those who did not look too closely. This would be useful for hunting. Prey that saw a beautiful woman in distress would approach. Prey that saw what it truly was would run. And it discovered that it could smell sin. Not literally, not the way a dog smells food or a tracker smells a trail. But there was something in its new senses that allowed it to detect the darkness in human hearts. When it encountered a person who had been faithful, who had kept their vows and honored their commitments, that person seemed dim to its perception, uninteresting, not worth the effort. But when it encountered a person who had betrayed, who had cheated and lied, and broken the trust of those who loved them, that person blazed like a beacon in its mind. But first, before it could begin its eternal hunt, it had one piece of unfinished business to attend to. It had to find Raphael. The creature turned toward the path that led away from the burning hut, the path that Raphael had taken when he left her to die. His scent was still there, mixed with blood and sweat, and the acrid tang of rage. It would follow that scent to the ends of the earth if necessary. It would track him through jungle and mountain and city and sea. It would find him no matter how far he ran or how well he hid. And when it found him, it would show him what true horror looked like. The creature began to move, flowing through the jungle like a shadow given terrible purpose. But the scent was fading. Raphael had not gone home. The creature realized this as it followed his trail, as the path diverged from the route to the Mendoza house and headed instead deeper into the jungle toward passes that led over the mountains and into territories beyond. He had taken the children and fled, abandoning everything he owned, everything he had built, in favor of putting as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of his crimes. He had expected her to die. He had expected the fire to consume the evidence of what he had done. But some part of him, some instinct for self-preservation, had known that leaving anything to chance was foolish. And so he had run. The creature followed for hours, tracking through the night as the moon wheeled overhead. The trail grew fainter as Raphael moved faster, as he put miles between himself and his former life. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the scent had faded to almost nothing, dispersed by wind and water and the passage of time. It lost him somewhere in the high passes where streams crossed and recrossed and the trail split into a dozen possibilities. The creature stood on a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of jungle and mountains, and it screamed its frustration to the uncaring sky. The sound echoed for miles, causing villagers in distant settlements to cross themselves and hurry indoors. Raphael had escaped. Her tormentor, her murderer in all but final fact, had slipped through her claws and vanished into the vast wilderness of Colombia. For a long time the creature stood motionless, letting the rage flow through it, letting the hatred burn. It had been cheated of its primary target. The one person it most wanted to destroy had eluded it. But there would be others. Raphael was one man, but men like him were everywhere. If it could not punish Raphael himself, it would punish all who shared his sins. Every man who set foot in its territory with betrayal in his heart would pay the price that Raphael had escaped. Every cheater would feel the claws that had been meant for him. Every liar would look into eyes of darkness and understand in his final moments that judgment had come at last. The creature turned back toward the lowlands, toward the scattered settlements and lonely farms, where its prey waited, unknowing. And so it began. More than a century has passed since that night of blood and fire in the Colombian jungle. The world has changed in ways that Isabella Mendoza could never have imagined. Cities have grown where forests once stood. Roads of asphalt now cut through valleys that were once accessible only by mule trail. Electricity hums in houses where oil lamps once flickered. The modern age has arrived, bringing with it televisions and telephones, and the comfortable assumption that monsters belong only to stories told to frighten children. But the jungle remembers. The old parts of Colombia, the places where the trees still grow thick, and the paths still wind through shadows that have never known sunlight, these places remember everything. They remember the blood that soaked into the soil. They remember the screams that echoed through the night. They remember the bargain that was struck between a dying woman and something that should never have been given a name. And they remember La Patasola. The legend spread from village to village in the years following that first terrible night. Woodcutters told the stories to their sons. Grandmothers whispered them to grandchildren gathered around cooking fires. Priests incorporated them into sermons about the dangers of infidelity, though they were careful to frame the tale as metaphor rather than literal truth. The Church does not officially acknowledge the existence of creatures born from pacts with darkness, but the Church has never had to walk the jungle paths at night. Over the decades, the people who lived in La Patasola's territory developed ways to protect themselves. Mirrors were the first line of defense. The old women said that La Patasola could not bear to see her own reflection, that the sight of what she had become filled her with a rage and revulsion that drove her to flee. Dogs were valued as guardians against the supernatural. People said that dogs could sense La Patasola's presence long before human eyes could detect anything amiss. Fire was perhaps the most reliable protection. La Patasola feared flames, they said, because of the fire that had nearly consumed her on the night of her transformation. And then there was the rhyme. No one knew who had first composed it or how they had discovered its power, but the words were repeated in every village, taught to every child, memorized by every man who had reason to venture into the dark places where La Patasola hunted. Patasola, Patasola, I am sorry you live alone, but if you dare to attack me, I will cut off your crutches. Better go and pack your bags. The 21st century has not been kind to legends. Young people in the cities laugh at the old stories, dismiss them as the superstitions of uneducated peasants clinging to outdated beliefs. They do not carry mirrors. They do not learn the rhyme. They venture into the jungle with smartphones and GPS devices, confident that technology has rendered the old fears obsolete. They are wrong. The disappearances continue. Hikers who set out on marked trails and never reach their destinations. Researchers who go into the forest to study wildlife and are never seen again. The authorities call these disappearances accidents, animal attacks, getting lost in terrain that remains treacherous despite modern mapping. The old people know the truth. Rafael Mendoza died of old age in a small town in Venezuela, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew what their grandfather had done in his youth. He never returned to Colombia. He never spoke of the wife he had mutilated and left to burn. He carried his secret to the grave, and whatever judgment awaited him in the afterlife, it was not the judgment that La Patasola had planned. But the Mendoza bloodline did not end with Rafael. His children had children. Those children had children of their own. The family scattered across South America and beyond, carrying genes that connected them, however distantly, to the man who had created a monster. Most of them have never heard of La Patasola. Most of them do not know that somewhere in the Colombian jungle, something ancient and patient is waiting for them to make a mistake. Because La Patasola has not forgotten. She cannot forget. The darkness that sustains her also preserves her memories with perfect clarity, keeps the wound of her betrayal fresh and bleeding no matter how many years pass. Sooner or later, one of his descendants will betray a lover. Sooner or later, one of them will wander into the jungle with guilt in their heart, and they will hear a woman crying in the darkness, and they will go to investigate. On that night, the debt will finally be paid. I have told you this story for a reason. Perhaps you think it is merely entertainment, a creepy tale to pass the time. Perhaps you are already dismissing it as folklore, as fiction, as the kind of thing that could never really happen. But consider this. The jungle does not care what you believe. La Patasola does not need your faith to exist. She hunted for a century before the internet was invented, before electricity reached the remote villages of Colombia. before anyone thought to write her story down. She will continue hunting long after you and I are dust, and now you know about her. The old people say that speaking of La Patasola draws her attention. They say that telling her story is like calling her name, like sending up a signal that can be seen across vast distances. They say that she listens, always listens for the sound of her own legend being passed from mouth to mouth. Right now, wherever you are, she knows that someone has been talking about her, and she is wondering whether the person hearing this story has secrets of their own, whether they have betrayed someone who trusted them, whether they have broken vows they swore to keep. Have you searched your conscience? Think carefully. Because if there is guilt there, if there is sin hidden in the chambers of your heart, she can smell it. Distance means nothing to her. Walls mean nothing. The modern world, with all its lights and noise, means nothing. She is very patient. She has been waiting for over 100 years. She can wait a little longer. Tonight, when you turn off the lights, listen carefully to the silence. If you hear something outside your window, a cry, a sob, a voice that sounds almost like someone you love calling for help, do not go to investigate. Do not open the door. Do not even look outside. Just lie there in the darkness. Keep your eyes closed and hope that whatever is out there moves on to easier prey. Because if you hear her voice, if she has chosen you, then all the mirrors and dogs and fire in the world will not save you. The only thing that might help is the rhyme, the old words that generations of terrified men have gasped out with their dying breaths. Learn them, remember them, keep them close to your heart. You may need them sooner than you think. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear crying in the darkness, remember what I told you. Remember what she is. Remember what she wants. And whatever you do, do not follow the sound of her voice into the shadows. Because La Patasola is hungry, and she never stops hunting.